Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is a 10-minute Bible Hour podcast, and as we've discussed many times, I think that you are an expert at pattern recognition and interpretation. You practice it all the time, and I think you way underestimate how good you are at that and how, without even really thinking about it, you can evaluate things, see things that fit a pattern, see things that deviate from a pattern. You're running that mental math all the time. It's part of how you stay safe and continue to survive in a world fraught with threats and potential dangers. Your brain works really, really well. And all of those skills that you're nurturing and developing all the time in conversation and observation and reading all of this different stuff, consciously and subconsciously, all of that can be applied to the Bible. And that's one of the reasons this podcast is the way it is, because I'm super optimistic about your ability, wherever you're from, whatever you're into, to understand the words on the page and understand what the Bible is doing, what it holds itself out as being, what it's trying to communicate, both to the original audience and to audiences that have since come and gone, and to a modern audience right now, and to you. And so I just think that's a blast. I'm super into it. I mean, I'm saying stupid things right now. You know that I'm into the Bible. I just think it's an amazing document, and I can't get enough. And even when you and I aren't hanging out and I don't have a microphone in front of my face like I do right now, I still read it all the time, and I think about it all the time, and I get curious about it, and I dig into things. And one of the points of curiosity that I often feel with the Bible is when I'm cruising along and I'm reading stuff, and I kind of get into flow, and I start to recognize the patterns. I'm like, oh, well, this author in the New Testament, they kind of write this way. This is how their personality comes through. Or even this author in an ancient extra-biblical text, this is how they sound. This is how they say stuff. You start to notice the patterns, but it's really curious and fun to me when something kind of deviates from the pattern. A turn of a phrase, a way of putting things, a colloquialism. And then I'm always curious, well, is that there in the original text? Or is that the best modern English approximation, analog to that concept that whoever translated this thing was able to come up with? And so when it's Greek, when I'm looking at the New Testament, I see something like that kind of stands out. I'm not great at Greek. I'm not good at Greek. I'm not serviceable at Greek. I'm a little bit below that. Yeah, it came up in school. I should have paid more attention. I don't know. It was hard. I had a lot of things going on in my life. So Greek was a little bit overwhelming, but I retained a decent amount. And I think I retained enough to be able to go and grind through this stuff using the resources that far better men and women, far more talented and knowledgeable men and women along the way have put together to make it work for hacks like me. So when I come across a weird turn of a phrase or something, I'll go dig into that just for fun. And it takes me maybe hours to really get to the bottom of it. And it would take somebody who's actually good and conversant in this ancient expression of Greek that the New Testament was written in, it'd take them 5 seconds. They just glance at it and be like, oh yeah, it's like this. That actually comes up in this other book over here, and this history over here, and in this poem that this Greek poet wrote over here. They just know that stuff. It's an amazing discipline, and I have the utmost respect for people who are good at it. I'm not in the minor leagues. I'm not in the farm system. I'm not in the same zip code as them, but I'm really grateful that they would dumb down the tools enough that I can play a little bit in their sandbox as well and try to have some degree of self-discovery and kind of be able to picture how it's done. I think it's a blast. And I think you can do that too. It's way more accessible than it seems like it would be at first. I can kind of do that when I get into New Testament questions about the text. When I get into Old Testament questions, where overwhelmingly the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, man, I don't know what I'm doing. That's overwhelming to me. Yes, Hebrew came up in my education. And yes, there are people I went to school with who were really good at it and are probably still really good at it. No, I was not and am not one of those. And I have to work hard to get into the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. You'll notice we don't do that much here. And it's mostly because I just want to avoid embarrassing myself because it's intense. And yet, from time to time, I come across passages in the Old Testament where there's a turn of a phrase that stands out from the rhythm and from the pattern. And then I'm curious, well, what the heck? Why is that there? And Esther is a really interesting animal that way, because whereas you would kind of expect that if Esther was a product of a slightly later generation, after there'd been more cross-population, cross-pollination between the Greeks and the Persians, you would expect that if Esther was a later creation closer to the time of Jesus, there'd be a whole bunch of Greekisms and Greek turns of phrase that would be familiar to me because of my studies in Greek history in the New Testament. But it doesn't look to me like there's much of any Greekism in the book of Esther. Instead, it looks like you've got a bunch of Hebraisms, not sure that's the right term, and a bunch of references that would make sense to a pre-heavily Greekicized Persian audience. This is all going somewhere, I promise. So if Esther had been written, say, after Alexander the Great brought Greek culture with him and conquered Persia and intermarried a bunch of Greeks with a bunch of Persians, if it were written that late, like in the late 300s or later, you'd expect Esther to be a very Greek book. And there are later Greek iterations of Esther, but they're super, super different. This version that's in your Bible, which we think is the original version, it just doesn't have familiar turns of phrases if you're not into Hebrew and Persian stuff. And so there have been a few that we've come across where I'm like, you know what? I just don't know what to do with that phrase. I assume it's well translated and I'm going to have to leave it at that. But there's one that you and I started talking about yesterday here in Esther 9:1. It's sticking in my craw, and I've been sitting here this morning trying to make sense of it with my very limited tools. And so this is what I'm looking at. Okay. Esther 9:1. See if what phrase here pops out to you as sounding kind of modern and unexpected. Okay. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. I totally paused on the phrase in question. I just completely gave it away if you're paying attention at all. It's the tables were turned. Doesn't that sound super modern? How do you get to the bottom of whether or not that's a good rendering of what happened there? Because here's the deal. If that is a good rendering, it's so awesome in terms of that little literary flourish. Because, I mean, where does the phrase, the tables were turned, come from? I mean, it's board games, right? And board games are super ancient. There were board games in ancient Persia. We know people have played games as long as people have been people. And games that you play on a board and with dice work a certain way. Whatever side of the board you are behind, that's your side. That's the perspective of operation as you attack the board, attack your opponent or whatever. And then the same is true of your opponent. So you're rolling dice, you're moving pieces around on the board. I think the phrase, the tables have turned, or oh my, how the tables have turned, simply means you're both still sitting in the same place, but what would happen if you just flipped the table 180 degrees? Well, now all of a sudden I'm playing from my opponent's established position and they're playing from my established position. Now all of a sudden I'm coming at the negotiation, the interaction with my opponent, the interaction with my pieces, benefiting from or using all of the things that they had done and set up and built, and they're stuck with whatever I had. And so, of course, the saying, oh my, the tables have turned, is kind of, well, you're about to get your comeuppance because of how you acted when you were in the power position, and now I'm in the power position. It's a little bit gloaty. It's a gloaty kind of saying, but it also feels like a very modern saying, right? So I go and I dig into all of this, and I've got my little Hebrew tools out here, which just make me feel nervous in my stomach. I should probably know this, and I don't. And what it looks like is that the tables turning is not exactly what the original language says, but the concept is there, and it looks like that's a reasonable English translation of the concept. This Hebrew concordance characterizes this word that I'm not even going to try to pronounce as to turn about, to turn over, to change, to overturn, to return. And then I go and look at all the other places where that kind of terminology or this word occurs in the Old Testament. And we get stuff from Genesis 3. There was a sword which turned in every direction to guard the garden. You get language about overthrowing cities, overthrowing a town. The staff transformed or was turned into a serpent in Exodus 7. The language about the river during the plagues turning into blood, that's the kind of the same language. So shifted, had a change of heart. Psalm 30, you have turned for me my mourning into dancing. In all of those examples, it's not just something evolving or changing, it's a flipping to something different. And so based on that very limited knowledge, it seems like a decent English expression of this concept is indeed the tables are turned. There was a game being played here, a game of thrones, a game of survival, a game of power, and the board was totally aligned in one direction. And it seems like the author of Esther is really trying to stress again and again that all of it got reversed. The edict that Mordecai writes is a direct reversal of Haman's chapter 3 edict, all the way down to the language of plunder. Everything Haman said to do, Mordecai says to do the other way. Now, in the end, the plunder aspect of that doesn't happen, and we're going to talk about that soon. But everything is a flipping of the tables, is a turning of the tables, rather. And so, look, somebody made a translational interpretive decision to use this phrase here, and I'm convinced that this is really on point. And one of those places where you're reminded that translation is an art and a science, because I think whoever made the decision to translate it this way really understands the heart of the themes and the motif and the undercurrent, the imagery that is going on throughout the book of Esther. So yeah, that one stood out to me. It took me a long time to grind through that to even come up with that very rudimentary treatment of the question about whether the tables are turned phrase is a modern invention or that's in the original text. But it just took me down an interesting path with this book and an interesting path with that theme. And next time around, I want to talk about how that theme carries out into the larger story of the Bible. I think there's some interesting stuff there as well. All right, I think that's plenty for the moment. I'm Matt. This is a 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.